Last time, we escaped the Lim forest, but not without a cost. The jungle had thrown us far off our intended route, and we were forced to cut across unfamiliar terrain to find our way back. Then we reached a deep ravine. The two cliff edges stood too far apart to cross in the darkness, so we made camp and waited for morning. Yet, as the night grew quiet, Hay could not shake a strange feeling. Something about the next day felt wrong, as if the jungle was warning us. What waited beyond that ravine would become one of the most dangerous moments of the expedition. Let's continue the story in Part 6 of the Lost Gold Expedition. That night, the jungle was eerily still. Lying awake, I pressed my ear against the ground. From somewhere far below, the sound of rushing water echoed up through the earth itself, as if it were coming from the depths of another world. An uneasy feeling refused to leave me. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking that something was wrong, that tomorrow would bring trouble. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a restless sleep, while the distant roar of the river drifted in and out of my dreams. We reached the edge of the ravine shortly after sunrise, yet the place was still cloaked in darkness. A thick blanket of white mist filled the chasm below. It was impossible to tell whether it was low clouds or fog rising from the water. Only when the sun climbed higher did the ravine slowly reveal itself. It was enormous. The gap stretched roughly 30 to 40 meters across. Sheer rock walls plunged almost straight down on both sides. Trees clung desperately to cracks in the cliff face, their trunks reaching upward toward the light. Looking down from above, their pointed tops resembled thousands of sharpened stakes. It took another few moments before we could finally see the river itself. Far below, at least 60 meters beneath us, a torrent of muddy water crashed through the narrow gorge. Jagged boulders split the current apart, sending white spray exploding into the air. Under normal conditions, it was probably nothing more than a shallow stream winding through a rocky riverbed, but days of heavy rain had transformed it into a raging flood. Branches, leaves, and entire tree trunks raced downstream at terrifying speed. Fortunately, we had no intention of climbing down there, even if we wanted to. The cliffs were simply too steep. Our only option was to find a way across. Deng turned toward the rest of us. He noticed the worry on my face and smiled. "So, hi. Any brilliant ideas?" I managed a faint smile. "I think we should follow the ravine until we find a narrower crossing." He nodded before looking at the others. "What do you think?" Sung studied the landscape for a moment. "This ravine cuts straight through the mountain range," he said. "Eventually, we'll find a lower section. The real question is, which direction do we go?" The four of us stood there discussing every possibility. In the end, we agreed to head upstream. Maybe we'd find a narrower crossing. Or perhaps, as Hoong suggested, we'd find a suitable tree and turn it into a bridge. It meant moving even farther away from our destination, but there was simply no better choice. Downstream, the cliffs looked even steeper. There was no chance of getting through that way. We hoisted our packs onto our shoulders and began following the rim of the ravine upstream. The trail was treacherous. A towering mountainside rose on one side of us. On the other, the cliff dropped straight into the roaring gorge below. Days of rain had soaked every rock with moss. Each step had to be tested before we put our weight on it. We grabbed onto tree trunks and hanging vines, inching our way forward, one careful step at a time. No one spoke much. One careless slip, and there would be no coming back. By late morning, the terrain finally began to level out. The steep rock face gave way to a forest floor blanketed with dry leaves, making the hike noticeably easier. Just as the sun reached its highest point, Hung stopped beside a tall Daoyo tree. Its trunk was perfectly straight, nearly 40 meters high, and thick enough that none of us could have wrapped our arms around it. He walked slowly around the base, running his hand over the rough bark before tilting his head back to study the crown. I immediately understood what he was thinking. He wanted to turn it into a bridge. "So, what do you all think?" he asked. Dung looked across the ravine, carefully judging the distance. "I think it'll work, if we can make it fall exactly where we need it." I stepped back several paces and sized everything up. The tree stood about 2 meters from the cliff's edge. The ravine here was only around 30 meters across, and the opposite side looked relatively flat. If we had to build a bridge, this was probably the best place we were going to find. Without wasting another minute, we dropped our backpacks and got to work. None of us carried an axe, only 2 lightweight jungle machetes. Cutting down a tree this size with those blades would take time. But bringing it down wasn't the hardest part. The real challenge was making sure it fell at exactly the right angle if it landed crooked. The bridge would be useless. Everything depended on Hung. He struck the first blow. The initial notch was cut low, on the side facing the ravine. A second cut was started slightly higher, on the opposite side. Then we rotated, taking turns with the machetes. Wood chips flew in every direction, carpeting the ground around the trunk. As the bark split open, thick white sap slowly seeped from the wounds. Within minutes, it darkened, turning a deep crimson that looked almost like fresh blood. Perhaps that was why the locals called it the blood resin tree. More than an hour passed. At last, the trunk was nearly severed. Hung raised a hand. "Everybody back." We stepped away. He looked up once more, checking the wind. Then, with slow, deliberate swings, he delivered the final cuts. We watched without breathing. "It's going. Stand clear." A faint crack echoed through the forest. Then another, louder. The giant tree trembled. Its crown swayed gently, then leaned farther and farther, until gravity finally took over. Crack, crack, craash. The enormous trunk thundered across the ravine. Its crown slammed into the opposite cliff, crushing young trees beneath it. The trunk bounced once, then settled firmly into place. For a heartbeat, no one said a word. Then the 3 of us burst into cheers. We had done it. Stretching across the ravine was a solid, natural bridge. The far end rested slightly higher, because the branches underneath acted like supports. If anything, that made the crossing even easier. Only Hung remained calm. He simply nodded. "Wait here." With his rifle slung over one shoulder and his machete in hand, he disappeared quietly into the forest. We pulled out our dry rations and ate while we waited. The afternoon sun blazed overhead. The jungle fell strangely silent, as though it were still half asleep beneath the heat. Only the endless chorus of cicadas and the deep roar of the river far below filled the air. Nearly an hour later, just as I was beginning to worry, Hung finally returned. Across his shoulders were 2 enormous coils of thick rattan vine, each strand about as thick as a man's thumb. He dropped them beside the stump, grabbed his canteen, and drank deeply. Dang immediately got everyone moving. We untied our hammock cords and joined them together into one long rope. Then he flattened one end of a rattan vine with the back of his machete and securely lashed it to the rope. After only a few minutes of rest, Hoom stood again. He slung his rifle across his back and looked at Deng. "I'll cross first. Feed me the line as I go." Deng nodded. "Be careful." Hung grinned. "Don't worry. I've got this." One end of the rope was tied around Hung's waist, with both arms stretched out for balance. He stepped onto the log. The bridge barely moved beneath his weight. Step by step, he crossed the ravine with remarkable confidence. Halfway across, he lowered himself onto the log, locking it between his legs, while using his machete to chop away the branches blocking the path. When he reached the far side, he cleared the remaining limbs from the treetop and pulled the rope tight across the bridge. We began feeding him the heavy rattan vine. Slowly, meter by meter, he hauled it across. Once he secured the far end around a sturdy tree, the rest of us pulled with all our strength until the vine stretched tight along the top of the log. It became a handrail. Simple, strong, safe. The bridge suddenly looked much less frightening. I let out a quiet breath. Maybe I'd been worrying for nothing. Hung crossed back to our side. He swung his backpack onto one shoulder and smiled. "I'll go first again. Leave your packs here. I'll carry them across afterward." Sun and I laughed. "We can manage our own packs." Dang nodded. "Fine, but we're using a safety line. No chances." He folded another length of hammock cord into 4 strands, tied one end securely around each person's waist, and looped the other over the rattan handrail. If anyone slipped, the rope should catch them. At least, that was the plan. Hoon crossed first without any trouble. Once he reached the opposite side, Dang turned to me. "You're next." I slipped off my sandals, stuffed them into my backpack, and stepped onto the log. The trunk was wide. Its rough bark gave my bare feet plenty of grip. Still, halfway across, I glanced down. The river was nothing but a ribbon of brown water, raging 60 meters below. For a moment, my head spun. I forced myself to look forward. One step, then another. A few seconds later, I was safely across. I dropped my backpack onto the ground and turned back. Dang looked at Sun. "Your turn." Sun smiled while tightening the straps on his backpack. "You go first. I'll bring up the rear." Dang crossed with the same steady confidence he always had. Then it was Sun's turn. He stepped onto the bridge, one hand on the rattan rail. With the other, he gently pushed the safety loop ahead of him as he walked. Halfway across, he looked up at me and smiled. It was the same warm, gentle smile I'd seen so many times before. None of us knew it would be the last. Crack! A tiny sound, so small, I almost wasn't sure I'd heard it. I looked down. Instinctively, one of the branches, supporting the far end of the bridge, had snapped. My blood ran cold. The entire log shifted. Just enough. Sun lost his balance. His arms flew out instinctively, trying to steady himself. It wasn't enough. The bridge rolled beneath his feet, and he disappeared. To be continued. The safety line snapped tight. Instead of plunging into the ravine, Sun was left dangling beneath the log. For one brief second, we all thought he could still be saved. The weight of his fall pulled the rattan handrail downward until it nearly touched the bridge. I grabbed the vine with both hands and pulled with everything I had. Beside me, Dang seized it too. "Stay calm, Sun. Don't panic." On the far side, Hung had already thrown off his ammunition belt. His combat knife clenched between his teeth. He dropped onto the log and began crawling toward Sun as fast as he could. Below us, Sun struggled to reach the safety rope, but his backpack had become a deadly burden. It had slipped under one arm, twisting his body backward and forcing his head downward toward the rushing river. "Drop your pack!" Davlong shouted. "Throw it away! If you lose the pack, you can climb back up!" Sun reached for one shoulder strap, then hesitated. I knew exactly what he was thinking. Inside that backpack was our map, the only map that could lead us to our destination. I opened my mouth to yell, "Forget the map," but the words never came. Something far worse caught my eye. The knot. The knot securing the safety line to the rattan handrail was slipping slowly, almost silently. "No!" I screamed. "Don't move! The knot's coming loose!" Sun froze instantly. His body folded awkwardly at the waist as he stopped struggling. The rattan vine in my hands became steady, but out on the bridge, the knot continued to creep. Little by little, the loose end grew shorter. Frayed white fibers began poking out from the knot, like strands of cotton slowly being pulled apart. I could only stare, my whole body locked in place. I've never felt so helpless in my life. Hung kept crawling, faster, faster. Every movement shook the bridge. 3 meters, 2 meters, 1 meter. Almost there. He stretched out his left hand, reaching desperately for the safety rope. Just one more second. The knot gave way. Everything happened at once. The rope whipped free from the handrail. The rattan vine shot upward in my hands, and Sun fell straight down. A single scream echoed through the gorge, bouncing from one cliff wall to the other, before being swallowed by the roar of the river. I stood, frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think. I watched the muddy water consume him in an instant. Nothing remained. No splash, no hand, no backpack, not even a ripple. It was as though the river had simply taken him. "How?" I whispered. "How could this happen?" A crushing pain tightened around my chest. I stumbled toward the edge of the cliff, still clutching the rattan vine with sweat-soaked hands, desperately searching the torrent below. There was nothing, only the river, only the endless roar. "Hi! Step back!" Dang grabbed me by the shoulder and pulled me away from the edge. I stumbled backward into a pile of broken branches, barely aware of where I was. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with the leather case on his belt and pulled out a pair of binoculars. He raised them toward the river below. Out on the bridge, Hung lay motionless, hugging the log. His face was pressed against the wood. His shoulders trembled. For one terrible moment, I wondered if this was all a nightmare. I bit down hard on my lip. Pain shot through my mouth. The taste of blood filled my tongue. No, this was real. After what felt like forever, Dang slowly lowered the binoculars. His voice cracked. "Hung, come back." Tears rolled down his weathered face, mixing with sweat. I snatched the binoculars from his hands. At first, I couldn't see anything. Everything was blurred by tears. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and forced myself to look again. Floating debris rushed downstream. Dark rocks punched through the raging water, sending white spray into the air. Half-submerged treetops bent helplessly with the current. I searched every corner of the river, again and again. Nothing. It was as if Sun had simply vanished. Only minutes earlier, he had smiled at me from the middle of that bridge. Now, there was nothing left. That afternoon, we left our backpacks behind, armed only with our rifles. We climbed across the rocks, along the edge of the gorge, searching more than 2 kilometers downstream. Deep inside, we already knew. No one could survive a fall like that. Still, we hoped. Maybe the current had carried his body against a boulder. Maybe it had caught beneath a fallen tree. If we could find him, no matter how impossible it seemed, we would bring him home. We would bury him with dignity. We searched until there was nowhere left to look. There wasn't a single trace. At last, Dang stopped. "We have to go back." Near the bridge stood a large tree. Hung quietly took out his machete and shaved away a patch of bark. Without saying a word, I stepped forward. Using my combat knife, I carved Sun's name into the trunk. Then, the date he died. Fresh sap slowly seeped from each cut, dark red, almost like blood. As it ran down the bark, it felt as though our own hearts were bleeding with it. We had no incense, no flowers, nothing. Deng gathered a few dry branches and lit a small fire beneath the tree. It was all we could offer our friend. The flames flickered silently in the afternoon wind. I rested my hand against the tree and finally broke down. If only I could have held him one last time instead. He had disappeared forever beneath the muddy water, without a grave, without a farewell, without even a body to bring home. Then I remembered the photograph Sun had once shown me, his wife and their little child. A painful question echoed through my mind. How would we ever tell them? The sun was already sinking behind the mountains. It was time to leave. We shouldered our packs in silence. No one spoke. No one looked at one another before turning away. We stood for one final moment, facing the place where our friend had disappeared forever. The fading sunlight painted the cliffs in shades of gold. Mist drifted above the river, Below, a gentle breeze moved through the ancient forest. Leaves whispered softly overhead, like an endless song, honoring those who never returned. "Let's go," Dung said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. We turned and walked away. When I reached the top of the slope, I looked back one last time. The lonely log bridge still stretched across the ravine, silent, unchanged, and for just a fleeting moment, I thought I saw Son standing there, smiling, watching us leave. I quickly wiped away my tears, tightened the rifle on my shoulder, and hurried after the others. Over the next few days, we pushed steadily toward the southeast, following the direction of the rising sun. No one spoke much. The pain of losing Sun weighed heavily on all of us. During the day, the endless climbing, thick jungle, and constant struggle to move forward kept our minds occupied. But night was different. When we gathered around the campfire, or lay beneath our thin shelter, listening to the sounds of the forest, the emptiness returned. It settled over us like a heavy blanket. Every one of us felt it. 3 days after leaving the ravine, we reached a small grassy clearing on the shoulder of a mountain. Although it was still early in the afternoon, we decided to stop for the day. We all needed the rest. The past few days had drained us, both physically and emotionally. Hoon had another reason for stopping. He wanted an open view of the night sky. Sung's death had left more than an empty place in our hearts. He had been the team's navigator. His knowledge, his experience, and most importantly, the map he carried, had all been lost with him. Now we had no compass, no map, only the sun by day and the stars by night. After the shelter was up, Dang picked up his rifle. "Get some rest. I'll see if I can find something for dinner." Without another word, he disappeared into the forest. Hung and I remained at the edge of the clearing. Neither of us spoke. In the distance, I could still see the mountain range that hid the ravine where we had lost Sun. From here, it looked almost peaceful. The last rays of sunlight rested gently on its peaks, while the lower slopes faded into shadow. Nothing about it hinted at the tragedy that had taken place there. In truth, it wasn't very far away. Although we had spent 3 days hiking, the rugged terrain had forced us to climb, descend, and circle around countless obstacles as the crow flies. We had covered only a short distance. Hoon sat quietly beside me. His eyes never left the mountains. I could tell his thoughts were somewhere else. So were mine. The afternoon slowly slipped away. The sunlight softened. White clouds gathered along the western horizon. A flock of birds crossed the sky, hurrying back to their nests. Their silhouettes grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared beyond the dark line of distant forest. Not long afterward, Dang returned. Slung over one shoulder was a large jungle bird. That evening, we roasted the meat over an open fire. As dusk settled across the mountains, darkness spread outward from the deepest parts of the forest. For a brief moment, the western sky flared with the final glow of sunset. Then it, too, disappeared, one by one. The first stars appeared. Dang studied the night sky for several minutes. Finally, he pointed toward the constellation we knew as the Big Dipper. "I think we're getting close." Before the accident, Son estimated we still had about 20 kilometers to the southeast. We've already covered more than half that distance. If his calculations were right, we could reach the search area within a few more days. He paused, still looking at the stars. The challenge now is making sure we're heading in exactly the right direction. He glanced around the fire. What do you think? Hung answered first. We need to be careful. Starting tomorrow, we should climb the tallest trees whenever we can, and search with the binoculars. That grassland may be hidden among the mountains. We could walk right past it without ever knowing. I picked up a stick and began drawing lines in the dirt. I have another idea. Let's imagine a straight line from here to our destination. Instead of following it directly, I sketched a series of wide zigzags. We move back and forth across that line, about 5 kilometers on each leg. Then, change direction at roughly 60 degrees. We'll travel farther, but we'll sweep a much wider section of forest. Deng leaned closer to study the drawing. A slow smile crossed his face. That actually makes sense. He looked toward Hung. What do you think? Hung smiled for the first time in days. The zigzag search is the right approach. He paused for a moment before continuing. But I doubt we'll find a perfectly flat grassland out here. This country is nothing but mountains. It could be a gently rolling plateau. From an aerial photograph, small changes in elevation might have looked completely flat. Whale Ing nodded thoughtfully. That's possible. But if we find the swamp cypress trees, we'll know we're in the right place. He stopped speaking for a moment. None of us moved. He had almost said something else. If Sun were here. The words never left his mouth. They didn't need to. All three of us were thinking exactly the same thing. Since the accident, none of us had spoken Sun's name very often. No one had agreed to it. It simply happened. Each of us knew how much the others were hurting. There was no need to reopen the wound. Yet, none of us had stopped thinking about him. The grief, the guilt, the endless questions that had no answers. They followed us every step through the jungle. Hung lowered his head into his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. It's my fault. All of it. He stared into the fire. If I'd cut away every supporting branch before we crossed, Sun would still be alive. Deng immediately shook his head. No, you're wrong. He took a slow breath before continuing. If anyone made a mistake, it was me. I should have crossed last. I should have checked every knot one more time. I should never have assumed they were secure. I couldn't bring myself to look at either of them. These were men who had survived years of war. Men who had faced artillery barrages, ambushes, and countless firefights. They had watched friends fall in battle. They had buried more comrades than anyone ever should. But this was different. Sun hadn't died under enemy fire. There had been no battle, no explosion, no bullets. We had watched death come for him 1 second at a time. We saw exactly what was happening, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, any of us could do. That helplessness hurt more than words could ever describe. I stared quietly into the flames. Then I spoke. None of us is to blame. It was an accident. Hung looked up sharply. His eyes were filled with anger. Not at me, at himself. Don't try to comfort me. I failed him. I'll carry that for the rest of my life. I met his eyes, then answered as calmly as I could. No one can see the future. We're not gods. I paused. The fire crackled between us, and maybe that's the hardest truth to accept. There are no gods watching over us out here. If there were, men like Sung would never have died that way. For a long time, no one spoke. Only the fire burned between us. Finally, Dung broke the silence. Hai is right. None of us is perfect. We're only human. He looked from Hung to me, then back into the fire. Being human means we make mistakes. We suffer, we grieve, and we carry memories that never leave us. His voice grew quieter. We can't change what happened, but we can make sure Sun's sacrifice wasn't in vain. He looked toward the darkness beyond the campfire, toward the mountains, waiting for us. We'll reach our destination. We'll finish this mission. We'll do the work he can no longer do. No one answered. No one needed to. That was our promise. Not spoken loudly, not written anywhere, but from that night on, each of us carried it in silence. The wind moved gently through the treetops. The fire suddenly flared higher, throwing dancing shadows across the leaves. Above us for a long time, the three of us sat there, without saying another word. Strangely, after finally sharing what each of us had been carrying inside, the weight on our hearts felt just a little lighter. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this true story, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in Part 8 of the Lost Gold Expedition.